The pungent aroma of burnt coffee jolted Daniel Hartman from his reverie. He'd been lost in thought again, staring at the yellowed photograph on his refrigerator while his morning brew turned acrid on the hot plate. With a sigh, he poured the ruined coffee down the sink, watching the dark liquid swirl away, much like the years that had slipped by since he'd left Willow Creek. At 53, Daniel's life in Portland had settled into a comfortable, if lonely, routine. His modestly furnished apartment, 6 blocks from the real estate office where he worked as a senior agent, had been home for 12 years. But on mornings like this, with rain pattering against the windows and memories crowding his mind, home felt like a hollow word. The wall clock ticked steadily, its rhythm a counterpoint to the soft tapping of rain. Daniel's gaze drifted back to the photograph, a snapshot from 1985, showing a teenage version of himself flanked by his parents outside Hartman & Son Hardware. His sister Sarah's pigtails were just visible at the edge of the frame, her characteristic half-smile caught mid-motion. "Daniel, hold still," his mother's voice echoed across decades. "This is for the store's 20th anniversary." The memory was so vivid it made his throat tighten. That summer had been their last good one, before the arguments started, before misunderstandings grew into chasms too wide to cross, before his father's stubborn pride and his own youthful rebellion created a rift that would last decades. A sudden clatter from next door startled him. Mrs. Peterson's cat knocking something over, no doubt. The thin walls of his apartment complex did little to muffle the sounds of his neighbors' lives. Daniel glanced at his watch and frowned. He was running late. As he knotted his tie, a dream from the previous night surfaced in his mind. He'd been back in the hardware store, organizing nail bins while his father called out inventory numbers from the back room. The phantom scent of sawdust lingered in his nostrils, more real than the actual smells of his apartment. Daniel shook his head, trying to dislodge the memories. There was no use dwelling on the past. He had client meetings to prepare for, paperwork to review. The present demanded his attention, even if it was a pale shadow of the life he'd once imagined for himself. He grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door, pausing to check his phone one last time. No messages, no missed calls. Not that he expected any. The last time he'd spoken to anyone from his family had been 3 years ago, when a well-meaning cousin had tried to broker peace during the holidays. The attempt had ended like all the others, with polite refusals and carefully worded excuses. As Daniel locked his apartment door, a pair of sparrows caught his eye, huddling under the eaves of the building across the street. They reminded him of the nest his mother used to maintain in the old maple tree behind their house, how she'd check on it every morning while watering her roses. With a deep breath, he squared his shoulders and headed out into the rain-soaked Portland morning, unaware that his carefully constructed life was about to be upended by a letter from home. The mail arrived earlier than usual that Monday morning, the metallic clatter of the mail slot cutting through the quiet of Daniel's apartment. He paused, his tie half knotted, listening to the soft thud of envelopes hitting the floor. Normally, he'd wait until evening to collect it. Bills and real estate circulars could always wait. But something compelled him to check immediately. Padding to the entryway in his sock feet, Daniel stooped to gather the pile of mail. Among the usual stack of envelopes, one stood out, cream-colored, with handwriting he recognized instantly. His hands trembled slightly as he read the return address: Sarah Hartman Collins, 247 Maple Street, Willow Creek, Oregon. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Daniel stumbled to his armchair, his carefully pressed suit wrinkling as he sank into the cushions. Sarah's handwriting was as neat as ever, each letter precisely formed, a trait she'd inherited from their mother. He turned the envelope over several times before finally sliding his finger under the flap. The letter inside was 3 pages long, written on lined paper that looked like it had been torn from a notebook. Sarah's usual composure seemed absent. There were several crossed-out words and ink smudges. The faint scent of lavender, Sarah's favorite hand lotion, wafted from the pages. "Dear Daniel," it began, "I hope this letter finds you well. I've started writing this so many times over the past week that my trash can is overflowing with crumpled attempts. But I can't put this off any longer. Mom is sick, Daniel. Really sick." The words blurred before his eyes. He blinked hard, forcing himself to focus. "The doctors found stage 3 ovarian cancer 3 months ago. She's been through 2 rounds of chemotherapy, but it's been rough. Dad's trying to keep the store running while taking care of her, but he's struggling. You know how he is. Too proud to admit it, but I can see him wearing thin. The medical bills are piling up and the store's not doing well. Haven't been many customers since the new hardware chain opened on the highway. Daniel stood abruptly, the pages clutched in his hand. He walked to the window, watching the morning traffic flow below while his mind raced. His mother, sick. His father, struggling. The store, the family legacy that had been the source of so much conflict, failing. A bus rumbled past, its brakes squealing as it stopped at the corner. A woman in a blue raincoat dashed across the street, narrowly avoiding a puddle. Life in Portland continued its steady rhythm, oblivious to the fact that Daniel's world had just been turned upside down. He forced himself to keep reading. I know things have been difficult between all of us for a long time. I'm not writing to place blame or dig up old wounds. But Daniel, they need help. We need help. Mom asks about you sometimes, when the medication makes her guards drop. She keeps your high school graduation photo in her bedside drawer. I've seen her looking at it late at night when she can't sleep. The traffic light outside turned red, and a line of cars stopped. A woman in a sedan was singing along to something on her radio, her head bobbing in time to a beat Daniel couldn't hear. He felt a sudden, irrational surge of anger at her carefree expression. I understand if you don't want to respond, Sarah's letter continued. God knows we've all made mistakes. But if there's any part of you that wants to try, that wants to bridge this gap, please, Daniel, come home. Not for me, not even for Dad, but for Mom. She doesn't have much fight left in her, but seeing you might give her the strength she needs. At the bottom of the last page was a phone number and a simple closing. Love, Sarah. Daniel walked to his desk and picked up his phone. His finger hovered over the keypad before he set it down again. What would he even say after all these years? The last time he'd spoken to his father, harsh words had been exchanged about Daniel's decision to sell his share in the store and move to Portland. His mother had cried, begging them both to be reasonable, but reason had long since left the building. He caught his reflection in the window, gray threading through his dark hair, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when he left Willow Creek. How many years had he spent building walls around his heart, convincing himself that his family's absence was a choice rather than a wound? The clock on his desk showed 8:45. He was already late for his first appointment of the day. With mechanical movements, he folded the letter and slipped it into his jacket pocket. But as he reached for his briefcase, he knew nothing would be the same. Sarah's words had cracked something open inside him, something he'd spent years trying to keep sealed. His phone buzzed, a text from his assistant reminding him about the 9 a.m. meeting with potential buyers. Daniel stared at the message, then did something he hadn't done in 20 years of real estate work. He canceled all his appointments for the day. The coffee shop on 4th Street had become Daniel's thinking spot over the years. Now, sitting in his usual corner booth, Sarah's letter spread out beside an untouched latte, he found himself adrift in a sea of memories. The bitter aroma of espresso mingled with the sweet scent of pastries, creating a comforting cocoon around him. Outside, Portland's perpetual drizzle had intensified into a steady downpour, raindrops racing each other down the window pane. The gloomy weather matched Daniel's turbulent emotions as he grappled with Sarah's news. He closed his eyes, and suddenly it was summer, 1982. The hardware store's bell jingled as he rushed in through the front door, proudly clutching his first paycheck from his paper route. The sound of the ancient ceiling fan mixed with the earthy smell of fertilizer and the sharp tang of paint thinner. His father's broad smile beamed down at him as Daniel announced he was investing his earnings in store inventory. "That's my boy," Dad had said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Thinking like a businessman already." The memory shifted, and now it was 1990. The store felt smaller, more confining. The same ceiling fan creaked overhead, but now it seemed to mock him with its endless, pointless rotation. "This store is your heritage, Daniel," his father shouted, face red with anger, veins standing out on his neck. "I built this for you, for our family." But Daniel, fresh out of college with a business degree and big dreams, had seen only limitations in the small-town store. "The world's bigger than Willow Creek, Dad," he yelled back, his own face flushed with frustration. "We need to expand, modernize, or we'll die." A gentle touch on his arm jolted Daniel back to the present. Jenny, the barista who knew his usual order, stood beside the table, concern etched on her face. "Everything okay, Mr. Hartman? You've been staring at those papers for an hour. Your coffee's gone cold. Daniel managed a weak smile. Just some family matters, Jenny. Thank you. He pushed the cold latte aside, suddenly craving something stronger. As Jenny walked away, Daniel's mind drifted to his mother's garden. He could almost smell the roses, mixed with the scent of her favorite lavender hand cream. Sunday afternoons spent deadheading flowers while she hummed old Beatles songs, her sun hat tilted at a jaunty angle. Sarah had always been the peacemaker, trying to bridge the growing gap between father and son. He remembered her words during one of their last real conversations. Dad's just scared of change, and you're scared of staying still. You're more alike than either of you will admit. With a sigh, Daniel pulled out his phone and found himself scrolling through old photos he'd never had the heart to delete. His nephew Tommy's birth announcement. Sarah had sent it despite the silence between them. A newspaper clipping about the store's 40th anniversary 5 years ago, which he'd found online but never mentioned to anyone. The afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the coffee shop floor. Daniel watched a young father and son walk past the window, the boy chattering excitedly about something, while his father listened with evident affection. The scene sent him back to another memory, working alongside his father in the store's workshop, learning to cut keys, the ratcheting sound of the key machine, the acrid smell of metal shavings, the weight of his father's hand on his shoulder, steadying him as he guided the blank along the cutting wheel. "Your hands are steady," his father had said, pride evident in his voice. "That's important in this business. Precision and patience. That's what makes a good craftsman. Precision and patience." Daniel had abandoned both in his rush to prove himself, to escape what he'd seen as the constraints of small-town life. Now, with years of perspective, he could see the wisdom in his father's words, wisdom that applied to more than just cutting keys. The coffee shop was nearly empty now. Jenny was wiping down tables, preparing for closing time. The hiss of the espresso machine and the clink of dishes being put away created a gentle backdrop to Daniel's tumultuous thoughts. He gathered Sarah's letter, folding it carefully along its creases. The decision he'd been wrestling with all day suddenly seemed clear, as if all these memories had been leading him to this moment. With fingers that trembled slightly, he pulled out his phone and opened his laptop's browser. Within minutes, he had booked a flight to Eugene for the following morning, the closest airport to Willow Creek. His heart racing, he typed a message to Sarah. "Got your letter. Coming home tomorrow. Don't tell Mom and Dad yet." As he drove home through the darkening streets of Portland, Daniel felt a mixture of terror and relief. Tomorrow, he would face everything he'd been running from for 20 years. He would see the store again, walk the streets of his hometown, and most importantly, confront the broken relationships he'd left behind. In his apartment, he packed a small suitcase with mechanical efficiency, his mind still swimming with memories. Before going to bed, he paused at his window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, in a small town nestled among Oregon's forests, his mother was probably lying awake, his father keeping vigil beside her bed. Tomorrow, he would begin the journey back to them, carrying 2 decades of regret and hope in his heart. As he turned away from the window, his gaze fell on the old photograph on his refrigerator. For the first time in years, instead of pain, he felt a glimmer of something else, the possibility of redemption. The rental car's tires crunched on the gravel shoulder as Daniel pulled over, just past the wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Willow Creek, population 3,842. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as he took in the familiar landscape. The October sun cast long shadows through the maple trees lining Main Street, their leaves a vibrant tapestry of red and gold. He drew a deep breath, the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves filling his nostrils. It was a smell unique to Willow Creek in autumn, one that brought a flood of memories rushing back. For a moment, he was 16 again, raking leaves in front of the hardware store, stealing glances at Melissa Thompson as she walked home from school. The reverie was broken by a truck horn blaring as it passed. Daniel startled, then eased the car back onto the road. As he drove down Main Street, his eyes darted from one familiar landmark to another. Miller's Diner, still advertising the best cherry pie in Oregon on a faded sign. Thompson's Pharmacy, where old Mrs. Thompson used to slip him extra candy with his mother's prescriptions. Everything looked smaller somehow, yet exactly the same. His heart began to race as the hardware store came into view. The faded Hartman & Son hardware sign still hung proudly despite its peeling paint. Daniel's throat constricted as he noticed the limited hours sign in the window, something the old Hartmans would never have displayed. Through the dusty storefront, he could see empty spaces on shelves that had once been meticulously stocked. He drove past without stopping, following Sarah's instructions to meet at her house first. His sister's home sat 3 blocks away, a modest 2-story with blue shutters and a well-tended garden. Before he could even turn off the engine, the front door flew open and Sarah stood on the porch. 20 years melted away as she rushed down the steps. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with gray, but her eyes were the same kind and determined. They stood awkwardly for a moment before she pulled him into a fierce hug. "You came," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "You really came." Inside, over coffee that neither of them really drank, Sarah filled in the gaps. Their mother had been admitted to Willow Creek General 3 days ago, with complications from the chemotherapy. Their father spent mornings at the hospital and afternoons trying to keep the store running, though customers were scarce. "He's too proud to admit it," Sarah said, twisting her wedding ring nervously. "But the store's barely staying afloat. The medical bills—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "How bad is it?" Daniel asked, dreading the answer. "Bad enough that Dad's considering selling, though it's killing him to even think about it. That store is his life, Daniel. It was supposed to be yours too, once." The unspoken weight of old arguments hung between them, heavy as the dark clouds gathering outside. "Does Mom know I'm coming?" Sarah shook her head. "I wasn't sure you would, and I didn't want to get her hopes up. But she's been asking for you more often lately. The doctors say—" She paused, composing herself. "They say having family close can make a difference." Daniel stood, walking to the window. Children were playing in the yard across the street, their laughter carrying through the glass. The sound was a stark contrast to the somber mood in the room. "I should have come back sooner," he said quietly. "We all could have done things differently," Sarah replied, joining him at the window. "But you're here now. That's what matters." The drive to the hospital was silent, tension building with each passing minute. As they pulled into the parking lot, Daniel's anxiety peaked. "What if Dad's there?" "He is," Sarah confirmed, squeezing his hand. "It's going to be awkward, Danny. There's no avoiding that. But Mom needs this. We all do." Room 215 was at the end of a quiet hallway. Through the half-open door, Daniel could hear the soft beeping of monitors and his father's voice, reading aloud what sounded like the evening news. The familiar cadence of that deep, gravelly voice sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. Sarah squeezed his hand one more time before gently pushing the door open. The scene before him stopped Daniel in his tracks. His mother, always so vibrant and strong in his memories, looked small and fragile in the hospital bed. Her hair was gone, a colorful scarf wrapped around her head. His father sat beside her, reading glasses perched on his nose, looking older and more tired than Daniel had ever seen him. The reading stopped abruptly. His father's hands gripped the newspaper tightly, knuckles turning white. For a heartbeat that seemed to last an eternity, no one moved. Then his mother's eyes opened slowly, confusion giving way to recognition. "Daniel." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it filled the room. "Is it really you?" He moved to her bedside, tears blurring his vision. "Hi, Mom," he managed to say, taking her thin hand in his. "I'm home." His father stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. For a moment Daniel thought he might leave, but instead, he simply moved to the window, his back rigid with tension. "My boy," his mother said, reaching up to touch his face. Her fingers were cool against his skin. "You look just like your father now." The comment hung in the air, bridging past and present, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital room floor. Outside, life in Willow Creek continued its steady pace, unaware that in room 215, 20 years of silence was finally being broken. The first week back in Willow Creek settled into an uneasy rhythm. Daniel took a leave of absence from his real estate job, renting a room at the Willow Creek Inn. Each morning he'd arrive at the hospital by 8, just as his father was leaving for the store. They performed an awkward dance of nods and mumbled greetings, neither quite ready to bridge the chasm between them. With his mother, conversation came easier. Between her treatments, they rebuilt their relationship one small story at a time. She told him about the grandchildren he'd never met, Sarah's kids, Tommy and Emma, and how Tommy had his grandfather's knack for fixing things. "Your father teaches him at the store sometimes," she said one afternoon, her voice tired but warm. "Just like he taught you." Daniel swallowed hard, the memory of those lessons flooding back. The smell of sawdust, the weight of tools in his hands, his father's patient instructions. "Mom, about the store." She patted his hand, her skin papery against his. "The past is past, sweetheart. What matters is now." But the past wasn't so easily dismissed. One rainy afternoon, Daniel stopped by the hardware store, intending to speak with his father. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, the sound echoing through aisles that were far too empty. The scent of paint and turpentine hung in the air, familiar yet somehow diminished. He found his father in the back office, surrounded by bills and invoices, looking older than his 70 years. The silence between them stretched tight as a wire. "The supplier and Eugene raised their prices again," his father finally said, not looking up. "Third time this year." It was such an ordinary complaint, so familiar, that Daniel felt something crack inside him. "Dad, let me help. I know about business, about modernizing. Like you helped 20 years ago?" His father's voice was sharp, but there was more pain than anger in it. "By telling me everything I'd built was worthless? That's not what I—" Daniel stopped, took a breath. The smell of old ledger books and coffee grounds brought back a rush of memories. How many times had he sat in this very office, learning the ins and outs of the business? "I was wrong. Not about the business needing changes, but about how I handled it. I was young and arrogant and scared." His father finally looked up, surprise flickering across his weathered features. "Scared? Of what? Of failing you, of being trapped, of not being good enough to carry on what you'd built." The words tumbled out, 20 years of unspoken truth. "But I was wrong about being trapped. I trapped myself, running away instead of working through it." The office clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Outside, rain drummed against the storage room roof, the same roof they'd repaired together the summer Daniel turned 16. He could almost feel the heat of that long-ago day, taste the lemonade his mother had brought them. "Your mother always said we were too alike," his father finally said, his voice rough. Both too stubborn to bend. Daniel looked at the man before him, not the towering figure of his youth, but a person who had carried the weight of this store, this family, for so long. Maybe it's time we both learned how. That evening, over coffee in the store's back room, father and son began the slow work of reconstruction. The rich aroma of the coffee mingled with the scent of wood shavings and metal, creating a backdrop for their tentative conversation. Daniel shared what he'd learned about modern business practices. His father talked about the store's loyal customers who'd kept them afloat despite the big box competition. As they talked, Daniel noticed the tension in his father's shoulders beginning to ease. For the first time in years, they weren't arguing about the past, but planning for the future. Together, they began to sketch out ideas that might save the family legacy. "We could set up an online inventory system," Daniel suggested. "Make it easier for customers to know what we have in stock." His father nodded slowly. "And maybe expand our custom services. There's still demand for that personal touch." As the evening wore on, their conversation flowed more freely. They reminisced about the store's early days, laughed over old mishaps, and slowly, carefully, began to rebuild the bond that had been broken for so long. When Daniel finally left for the night, the rain had stopped. The streets of Willow Creek glistened under the streetlights, and for the first time since he'd returned, he felt a glimmer of hope. There was still a long way to go, but they had taken the first step. As he walked back to the inn, he pulled out his phone to call Sarah. She answered on the first ring, her voice anxious. "How did it go?" Daniel looked back at the store, its windows dark now but no longer feeling like a monument to his past failures. "We're talking," he said simply. "Really talking." Sarah's relief was palpable even through the phone. "That's a start," she said. "That's a really good start." Word spread quickly through Willow Creek that Daniel Hartman had returned home. In a town where everyone knew everyone, news traveled faster than the autumn winds that swept down Main Street, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and ripening apples. It started with small gestures. Mrs. Thompson from the pharmacy stopped by the hospital with homemade chicken soup, the savory aroma filling the sterile room. "Just like your mother always loved," she said, her eyes crinkling with kindness. Bill Miller from the diner brought fresh cherry pie, remembering it was Daniel's favorite. The familiar taste of tart cherries and buttery crust brought tears to his eyes. Each visitor carried not just food, but stories, memories, and a reminder of the community Daniel had left behind. He found himself relearning the rhythm of small-town life, where a trip to the post office could turn into an hour-long catch-up session, and where people still left their doors unlocked at night. The real turning point came when Jack Wheeler, whose father had been one of the store's first customers, walked into Hartman and Son one morning. Daniel was behind the counter, the feel of the old cash register under his fingers both strange and familiar. "Heard you're trying to save the store," Jack said, laying a folder on the scratched wooden surface. "My accounting firm's been doing some research on small business grants. Thought you might be interested." Daniel leafed through the papers, hope rising in his chest. "Jack, this is—" "Thank you." Jack shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "This town needs Hartmans. Always has." That afternoon, Sarah's husband Tom, a web designer Daniel had only met briefly before, offered to build the store a website. "People these days want to know what's in stock before they drive over," he explained, his fingers flying over his laptop keyboard. "We could set up a basic inventory system, maybe even do some online sales." As they worked, Daniel found himself opening up to his brother-in-law, sharing stories of growing up in the store. Tom listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that showed a genuine interest in the family's history. "You know," Tom said during a break, "Sarah used to talk about this place all the time when we first met. I could tell how much it meant to her. To all of you." Daniel nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I forgot that for a while. I'm glad she didn't." The community support was overwhelming. Regular customers began returning, bringing friends. The bell above the door chimed more frequently, and the aisles were no longer eerily empty. The local newspaper ran a feature about 3 generations of Hartmans serving Willow Creek, complete with a photo of Daniel and his father in front of the store. One evening, as Daniel was closing up, he found his father studying the old photographs on the store's walls. The yellow light from the old fixtures cast a warm glow, softening the lines on his father's face. "Remember this one?" his father asked, pointing to a faded picture of the store's opening day. In it, a much younger version of his father stood proudly in front of freshly painted shelves. "Your grandfather took out a second mortgage on his house to buy this place. Everyone said he was crazy, that the town didn't need another hardware store." Daniel moved closer, the floorboards creaking under his feet. "But he proved them wrong. We all did." His father's voice was gruff with emotion. "You know, son, when you left—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I was so angry because I thought you were rejecting everything we'd built. But maybe you were just trying to build something of your own." Daniel thought about his real estate career in Portland, the success he'd achieved, and how empty it had felt without his family to share it with. The scent of wood and metal that permeated the store, once suffocating, now felt like home. "I never stopped being a Hartman," he said quietly. "I just forgot what that meant for a while." The bell above the door chimed, breaking the moment. Sarah entered with Tommy and Emma in tow, their cheeks flushed from the cool evening air. "Mom's asking for everyone," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "The doctors say her latest tests show improvement." At the hospital, they gathered in the small room that had become their second home. Daniel's mother was sitting up, more color in her cheeks than they'd seen in weeks. The harsh fluorescent lights couldn't dim the joy in her eyes as she looked at her family. "Look what Emma made," she said, holding up a crayon drawing of the hardware store, complete with a rainbow arching over it. The simple picture showed 3 figures in front of the store: Grandpa, Daddy, and Uncle Daniel. Daniel felt his father's hand on his shoulder, solid and warm. Outside the window, the sun was setting over Willow Creek, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. They were far from solving all their problems. The store still needed work. His mother's recovery was just beginning, and years of hurt couldn't be erased overnight. But as he looked around the room at his family, at the community that had welcomed him back without judgment, Daniel understood something his younger self had missed. Sometimes the biggest adventures happen in the smallest places, and the most important journeys lead you right back home. By December, Willow Creek had transformed into a winter wonderland. Snow dusted the storefronts along Main Street, and twinkling lights adorned the trees in the town square. Inside Hartman & Son Hardware, the transformation was equally remarkable. The once empty shelves were now fully stocked, and a steady stream of customers kept the old cash register ringing throughout the day. The new computer system, installed with Tom's help, tracked inventory with precision. The website he designed brought in orders from neighboring towns, expanding the store's reach beyond Willow Creek's borders. Daniel and his father had found a balance between tradition and progress, blending the store's old-world charm with modern efficiency. One crisp morning, as Daniel was arranging a display of snow shovels, he overheard his father explaining the finer points of selecting the right shovel to a young couple. "It's not just about the size," his father was saying, his voice warm with enthusiasm. "You've got to consider the handle length, the blade material. Each choice tells a story about the person using it." Daniel smiled to himself, remembering how he'd once dismissed such attention to detail as unnecessary. Now he understood its value. It wasn't just about selling products, but about being part of people's lives, their stories. At home, Daniel's mother's recovery, though slow, continued to surprise her doctors. The chemotherapy treatments had ended, and while she remained weak, her spirit grew stronger each day. She had moved back to the apartment above the store, converting the living room into a temporary bedroom where she could hear the familiar sounds of the business below. One evening, as Daniel helped her arrange her pillows, she took his hand. Her grip was stronger now, her skin warmer to the touch. "You know what the hardest part of being sick was?" she asked, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It wasn't the pain or the treatments. It was watching your father try to carry everything alone. He wouldn't admit he needed help, just like you wouldn't admit you needed family." Daniel sat on the edge of her bed, the old springs creaking just as they had when he was a child seeking comfort after a nightmare. "I was so focused on proving myself that I forgot what I was trying to prove, and to whom." She smiled, touching his cheek. "Sometimes we need to get lost to find our way home." Downstairs, the store hummed with pre-holiday activity. Daniel could hear his father's voice explaining the finer points of power tools to a customer, while Sarah's kids helped stock the newly organized shelves. The store's revival had become a family project, with everyone contributing their strengths. The biggest surprise came from the community itself. When word spread about the store's medical bills, the town organized a fundraiser. The event, held in the high school gymnasium, featured an auction of local crafts and services. The air was thick with the scent of cinnamon and pine from holiday decorations, and the buzz of conversation filled the room. Daniel watched in amazement as neighbors bid generously on items, many paying far more than asking price. Mrs. Thompson's quilts, Mr. Johnson's hand-carved birdhouses, even a year's worth of tune-ups from the local mechanic, all went for well above their value. "Your grandfather used to say a hardware store is more than just nuts and bolts," his father told him as they watched the auction. "It's where people come to build their dreams, fix what's broken, make something new from the pieces they have." Daniel looked at his father, noting how the past months had changed them both. The tension that had always seemed to live in his father's shoulders had eased, replaced by a quiet confidence in their shared future. "He was right," Daniel replied, "about that and so many other things." The evening ended with the announcement that the fundraiser had covered not just the remaining medical bills, but also provided enough to update the store's heating system. As the crowd cheered, Daniel caught sight of his mother wiping away tears, surrounded by her oldest friends. The warmth in the room had nothing to do with temperature. Later that night, after closing the store, Daniel and his father sat in the workshop where he'd learned to cut keys so many years ago. The familiar smell of sawdust and metal shavings brought back memories, but now they were tinged with hope rather than regret. "I've been thinking," his father said, turning an old brass key over in his hands. The soft yellow light of the workbench lamp caught the metal, making it gleam. "The store's sign still says, Hartman & Son. Maybe it's time to make that true again. Not as boss and employee, but as partners. Equal stakes, equal say." Daniel felt his throat tighten. "Dad, are you sure?" His father's eyes, so like his own, met his gaze steadily. "You've proven yourself, son. Not just in business, but in what matters most. You came back when we needed you, and you stayed. That's worth more than any business degree." As they shook hands, sealing their new partnership, Daniel felt a sense of coming full circle. The workshop, once a symbol of all he'd left behind, now represented a new beginning. Spring arrived in Willow Creek with a burst of renewal that seemed to mirror the Hartman family's transformation. The hardware store, now a perfect blend of old-world charm and modern efficiency, had become a model for small-town business adaptation. Other local shop owners frequently sought advice from Daniel and his father about modernizing while maintaining their community connections. One particularly busy Saturday morning, Daniel was helping a young couple select paint for their first home. The smell of fresh paint samples filled the air as he explained the differences between finishes. From the corner of his eye, he caught sight of his father giving Tommy a lesson in mixing custom paint colors, the same lesson he'd received 30 years ago. "The secret," his father was saying, his voice carrying over the hum of customers, "is understanding that every color has a story, just like every customer has a story." Daniel smiled, remembering how he'd once dismissed such wisdom as old-fashioned. Now he understood its true value. The store wasn't just selling products, it was participating in people's lives, their dreams, their stories. His mother's recovery had progressed remarkably. Though she still tired easily, she had resumed her position as the store's heart, keeping books from her desk near the window, where she could greet customers and oversee the family's comings and goings. Her garden behind the store was blooming again, tended now by both her and Sarah's children. One evening, as Daniel was closing up, a familiar face appeared at the door. Michael Chen, his former real estate partner from Portland. The bell chimed as Michael entered, looking around with undisguised curiosity. "So this is where you've been hiding," Michael said, his polished shoes clicking on the hardwood floor. "When you said you were taking over your family's hardware store, I thought you'd lost your mind." Daniel led him through the store, showing off the new inventory system and online ordering platform. The scent of fresh-cut lumber from the back room mingled with the crisp smell of new merchandise. "It's different from selling million-dollar properties," he admitted, "but it's real. Everything here matters to someone." Michael nodded thoughtfully, running his hand along a shelf of neatly arranged tools. "You know, we're opening a satellite office in Eugene. Could use someone who understands both real estate and local business, if you're interested in keeping a foot in both worlds." The offer hung in the air between them. Once, it would have been everything Daniel wanted. Now, as he looked around at the store his family had built, at the life he was rebuilding, the appeal had faded. "Let me think about it," he said, already knowing his answer would be no. His place was here, building something that mattered. That night at dinner, his mother noticed his contemplative mood. The family was gathered around the old oak table in the apartment above the store, the aroma of his mother's pot roast filling the room. "Something on your mind, sweetheart?" Daniel shared Michael's visit and offer. His father's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and for a moment, the old tension flickered in the air. "You should consider it," his father said, surprising everyone. "You've helped make the store strong enough to handle change now." Daniel looked at his father, seeing not the stubborn man of his youth but a wise partner who had learned to bend without breaking. The lamplight softened the lines on his father's face, highlighting the gray at his temples. "The store's not the only thing that's stronger," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm not going anywhere. My life is here now." The relief in his mother's eyes said everything words couldn't. Later that week, the family gathered for a celebration, the store's first profitable quarter since his mother's illness. They set up tables in the garden, strung lights between the trees, and invited the whole town to share in their joy. As twilight settled over Willow Creek, Daniel watched his father teaching Tommy how to use a level, while Emma helped his mother arrange flowers in mason jars. Sarah and Tom were setting up the food table, stealing kisses when they thought no one was looking. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers and the promise of summer. Mrs. Thompson arrived with her famous potato salad, followed by a stream of neighbors bearing dishes and good wishes. The Wheeler family brought their guitars, and soon music filled the evening air. Even old Mr. Peterson, who hadn't left his house much since his wife passed, made an appearance, his cane tapping a rhythm on the garden path. Standing slightly apart from the crowd, Daniel felt a profound sense of rightness. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from a Portland client he'd helped before leaving. Another real estate opportunity. Another chance at his old life. He typed a polite refusal, then turned off his phone. The hardware store's lights glowed warmly in the gathering dusk, the new sign catching the last rays of sunlight. Through the window, he could see the fresh paint, updated displays, and the old wooden counter where 3 generations of Hartmans had served their community. His father appeared beside him, 2 bottles of beer in hand. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the celebration unfold. The murmur of conversation and laughter washed over them, punctuated by the occasional strum of a guitar. "You know," his father said finally, his voice gruff with emotion, "your grandfather used to say that success isn't about the tools you sell, but the lives you touch." Daniel took the offered beer, clinking it against his father's bottle. The cool glass was a welcome contrast to the warm evening air. He was a wise man. That he was, his father agreed. That he was. As they stood there, father and son, Daniel realized that he had finally found what he'd been searching for all along. Not success as defined by the outside world, but the deep satisfaction of being part of something larger than himself, of continuing a legacy while forging his own path. The party continued into the night, a celebration not just of the store's success, but of family, community, and the power of coming home. 1 year later, on a bright autumn morning, Daniel stood in front of Hartman & Son Hardware, watching as his father hung a new frame in the store's wall of memories. The soft clinking of the hammer and the fresh scent of wood varnish filled the air. Inside the frame was a recent photograph of 3 generations of Hartmans, his father, himself, and Tommy, who had just started learning the register on weekends. His mother sat in her garden chair between them, her hair grown back silver and beautiful, her smile radiant. The store had evolved beyond their initial hopes. The online business was thriving, shipping Hartman's custom paint blends and specialty hardware across the state. Yet they'd maintained the personal touch that made them special. Each order included a handwritten thank you note, and local customers still dropped by just to chat, the bell above the door chiming a welcome dozens of times a day. His mother's garden had become a community gathering spot, with benches where elderly customers could rest and a small play area for children. The scent of roses and lavender mingled with the hardware store's familiar smells of wood and metal. Sarah had started teaching gardening classes there on weekends, passing on their mother's knowledge to a new generation. That morning, as Daniel unlocked the front door, he noticed a young man standing uncertainly outside, holding a set of blueprints. The stranger's hesitation reminded Daniel of himself, years ago, full of dreams, but unsure of the path forward. "Can I help you?" Daniel asked, stepping out onto the sidewalk. The young man shifted nervously from foot to foot. I'm hoping to open a small woodworking shop," he said, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke. "Everyone in town says if anyone knows how to get started right, it's the Hartmans." Daniel smiled, remembering his own young ambitions, now tempered by wisdom and experience. "Come on in," he said, gesturing towards the store. "Let's talk about your dreams over coffee. My father will want to hear this too." As they walked into the store, the bell chiming above them, Daniel caught his reflection in the window. He saw his father's stance in his shoulders, his mother's kindness in his eyes, and something entirely his own, the contentment of a man who had finally found his place in the world. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes in its beam, just as it had that day when he'd received Sarah's letter. But now, instead of illuminating a man lost in regret, it shone on a future bright with possibility. His father emerged from the back room, greeting the young man with the same warmth he'd shown customers for 40 years. As they gathered around the old planning desk, its surface worn smooth by generations of hands and dreams, Daniel heard his mother's voice from the garden, teaching Emma the names of the fall flowers. Life wasn't perfect, it never is, but it was rich with the kind of meaning that can only come from being part of something larger than yourself. A family, a legacy, a community. The bell chimed again as another customer entered, and Daniel moved to help them, carrying forward a tradition that had found its way home, just as he had. In Willow Creek, the hardware store still stands on Main Street, its windows bright with promise. its doors open to all who enter. And if you listen carefully, you might hear 3 generations of laughter mixing with the sound of that old brass bell, telling a story of loss and return, of bridges rebuilt, and of love that, like the finest tools in Hartman and Son hardware, was built to last. What did you think of the story? Please leave a comment with your opinion. 2 buttons will appear next to it, one to subscribe, if you haven't already, and another to watch other exciting stories. Make your choice. Thanks for watching this far. See you soon.